This is another ATC Office Hours. I'm here with Bjarni Hannesson from Moss Golf Club in Iceland and Jason Haines from Cabot, Cape Breton in Canada. Welcome, Bjarni and Jason.
Thanks for having us.
And so we are kind of a turf math crew. We have had a couple of episodes where we've talked about turf math. And I wanted to talk about turf math, measuring units a little bit. I think we'll get to that. But I also wanted to talk about the growth ratio, which is we're going to talk a lot about growth ratio because it's something that's not intuitive at first. It's something that Jason came up with, I think, in 2018, and he started off calling it the turfgrass speedo. Is that a correct memory?
Yeah, it was originally the speedo, and that was just because the way I visualized it was like a little, speedo chart, and I had originally put it together because I kept getting questions about, and we still get questions about how fast should we grow the grass, and so this was a way to figure out how fast the grass should grow relatively.
And so you came up with that in 2018, and I was like, we're measuring the clipping volume already, Jason. I don't see how adding a ratio to it with the growth potential really adds anything meaningful. And I thought you're like getting a little bit too far into spreadsheet land. Right. So that's my initial impression in 2018. But I'm like, Jason finds it really useful. I respect his assessment. So I think he, maybe there's something to it, but I didn't get it. But I did when I was doing back then. I was into, I was calling it the Genki level, which was the idea of how much are we pushing the grass? Are we over fertilizing the grass for a certain time of year? Like if you put a lot of fertilizer in January when there's snow on the ground, that's pushing the grass too much. So you'd have a high Genki level. Or if you have a really high growth potential, like perfect weather in May, and you put no fertilizer whatsoever, that's kind of starving the grass. So that would be what I would call a low Genki level. So in 2019, I was all into that kind of thinking, and I was just trying to show fertilizer amount versus the predicted fertilizer amount based on the growth potential. And you added in this clipping volume bit that I really didn't understand. And then you kept doing it, and then you got another post and you said something like, this is a really useful tool. And you used it 2018, 2019, and it was working really good.
Yeah, and ultimately, like the Genki or things like growing degree days, these are just kind of models, but they don't actually take what you're trying to manage, which is the growth rate of the grass, into account. So the growth ratio has the actual amount of grass that you're growing as part of the equation. So it's not like it's kind of a theoretical number, but it has real numbers. And that's, as a turf manager, what we're trying to measure to manage is growth. So if you're not including growth in your calculations, then it's kind of, it's really not really getting the big picture.
Okay. So we are working through what the growth ratio is and how it can be used because I guess at some point it clicked to me. And so all of a sudden it made sense. And I started doing or making more use of it. I started doing some more blog posts about it. And in, I think the late 2022, early 2023, I did a couple blog posts about it. And one of those, the growth ratio equation, has now made it onto the top 12 posts from the past 2 years on the ATC website in terms of what people are reading. And if I look at what people search for on the ATC website or check the Google search records for hits that go to the ATC website, there's quite a few searches about this growth ratio, the turf grass growth ratio. And so I thought, let's sit down and let's talk for a long time about this, and let's try to explain why it's useful and how it works, because it doesn't actually make sense to people at first. It didn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to a lot of people. I'll tell one quick story. Chris Trittabaugh from Hazeltine, he and I talked about it at Masters Week in 2023. We talked about it quite a bit. And I thought I was under the impression that as soon as the grass started growing, he was going to start making nitrogen fertilizer adjustments at the start of the season in 2023 based on growth ratio, based on us spending hours together talking about it. And yet it turned out that he didn't understand it to the detail that he thought he did, or that I thought he did. And it wasn't until August that he realized he actually wasn't really using the growth ratio. And then it kicked in, and he used it for the last couple months of the season. And he said, wow, this is really good. So it's something that I understand there's like 2 or 5 people in the world that are using this. If you're using growth ratio, if you're like using growth ratio and you know you're using growth ratio, send us a message in the chat and tell us. But as far as I know, it's like Jason and Chris Trittabaugh are using it. And yet I find it so useful that I want to write about it. I want other people to try it. If I was a golf course superintendent, I'd be doing it. I just put a post on Pace Turf, an update on Pace Turf about 6 different ways to figure out how much nitrogen to apply, and said that the one that I would choose is using the growth ratio. So I want to explain to people and let them ask questions of us about it if they want to, about what this is and how it works, and how you can get over that hurdle from having it sound like nonsense to having it be intuitive and be like, wow, that's so simple.
Well, we can give it a try, but firstly, I would just like to say these masters conversations would be a lot more about growth ratio, would be a lot more informative if I was there in person. So if anybody is watching that can make that happen, I'm interested in having growth
See what you
ratio
did there. That was good.
conversations at the masters. Yeah.
Well,
So kind of what I again, it goes back to people were always kind of wondering how fast should you grow the grass, and I had kind of noticed that the amount that you should grow the grass depends on the time of the year. How much you should grow it in the spring is different than what you should grow in the summer, what you should grow in the fall, and there's a lot of things that go into growth rate. So nitrogen is one of them, temperature is another, mineralization from the soil, all that kind of stuff. So trying to account for all those things with all these various models just didn't really, it seemed too complicated for me. Ultimately, I don't really care where the growth is coming from. I just want to have the right amount based on the time of year. And for the most part, it was temperature was the limiting factor. So, because we could control things like water and nitrogen. So trying to figure out what the right amount is. And so we have this growth potential formula. It's not perfect, especially we've discussed before in the spring at cold temperatures. But for the most part, the growth potential uses the weather, the temperature, and it gives you a percentage from 0 to 1 or 100%. So we could just apply an amount of growth to that percent. And I had I've been measuring clippings, I think, since 2012. I kind of had a good idea, and I was growing POA at the time, of what is the most grass you would ever want to cut in a single day. And that's about 20 milliliters per square meter. That seemed like a reasonable maximum amount. Now that's just for normal growth. That's not for like recovery or anything else, but that's just a normal amount. So I use that number, the 20. You multiply that by the growth potential for the day. So if the growth potential is 100%, then your standard amount of growth would be 20 milliliters. If it's 50%, it would be 10 milliliters. And if it's 1%, it's like 0.2 milliliters. So that kind of gives you a target. Now you need to compare your actual amount to that ratio. So let's say today the growth potential, it's a perfect 20 degrees out, it's 100%. And the model says we should be growing 20 milliliters of grass per square meter. But we go out and we cut 10. That means our ratio is 0.5. So we're growing half as much as the model suggests. Now, the model isn't a target. It's just something to compare against. So we are different grasses have different, I would guess, maintenance levels, different recovery levels, and maybe even a different like tournament condition level. So I found when I was growing POA that if I was below 85% of that standard amount, I had issues with traffic and disease like anthracnose. But if I was able to keep my growth rate at 85% of that model, I was able to eliminate those issues. So I mean, and then I mean other times like you have winter damage and you're coming out of spring and you're doing whatever you can to grow the grass, but it's still not growing that much. But relatively to the weather, you might be at 500%. So if the model says you should be growing 1 mil and you're getting 5 mils per day, you're outperforming that weather by 500%. So it's another tool to kind of just let you know that the grass is growing pretty quick if you wanted it to. So it's not always just about hitting a target. Sometimes we need recovery, so we need to go at a higher rate, and or tournament, we need to grow it at a lower rate, and it just kind of gives you just a target to manage your grass, whether it's PGRs or nitrogen rates.
One point that's very good for us as turfgrass managers is that the fact that often when you're looking out the window and this happens a lot to Icelandic greenkeepers, you're looking at the grass, it doesn't seem to grow that much. This is a very good tool to say, yeah, actually you are considering how cold it is. You're doing okay, just breathe, just wait for, the temperatures to pick up. Well, they never pick up here, but get slightly better. So it's good for that. It's good for that, just to make you sleep a little bit better overnight, and it's very good for that. But one of many things that's good for them. So,
yeah. Well, speaking of windows, I'm looking out my window right now, and there's snow up to about here.
Yeah, that's a lot of snow that you're experiencing there. Is that all snowfall or mostly drift?
Mostly drift. We had 3 feet fall in about a meter fall in 2 days with 70 kilometer an hour winds. So it's we had 20 foot or 5-6 meter drifts all over the place. We're still digging out a week later.
Wow.
Yeah.
I saw. Yeah, you posted those pictures on the Discord of the tractors buried in snowdrifts. It's like, wow, that's impressive. Good thing you knew where those were, or you wouldn't find them.
That's why we were digging them out, is so that we didn't find them with a snowplow or a snowblower.
Well,
yeah.
So what I didn't understand at first, and now it seems to me that what the growth ratio is, it's the actual clipping volume divided by the expected clipping volume. Would you agree with that as a definition?
Yeah, and that, I mean, as a technical way, yeah, that's what it is, and then we use running averages or to kind of smooth the data out.
Yeah, or you sum it because you don't mow. You like calculate it daily of how much the grass should have gotten mowed this day if you ran a mower across it, but you don't mow every day. But you add those together, or you take the average or something. But it's So this is perfect. So I want us to keep circling back to this because I think that if we explain it multiple times and again, this will be boring for the average person, but the average person is not watching a turf math video, or they're not listening to a turf math podcast. So I'm not concerned about the average person. I want to try to make this really clear to the people who are interested in, like, what is this growth ratio and how do you use it? But we can circle around and talk about a couple of other topics and then come back to this, which might help us to it might help to learn things by changing the topic and then coming back. And I know you guys have been traveling a lot recently. I saw you both met in person at Harrogate at BTME, and I think Bjarni, before that, you'd been in a tropical place looking at
Yes.
tropical grasses, and Jason, you'd been to Scotland. So maybe let's start with Jason. Jason, tell us about your Scotland trip.
So the week before BTME, I did a tour of a number of links style and a couple non-link style golf courses in Scotland. And yeah, there it is. I have not been to Augusta. I was not there. If anybody out there
Just
So
would like to make that
Augusta,
happen.
on the Augusta thing, yeah, I'm drinking coffee out of a Augusta National cup, and oh, Jason's got a Talking Greenkeeper sticker. Nice.
Yeah.
Bjarni,
I
yours
didn't
is
know this was a show and tell.
Bjarni's got IKEA. But just to talk about Augusta, wow, there's a lot of another Talking Greenkeeper sticker. That's awesome, Bjarni.
Worldwide. Yeah, so yeah, I was touring Scotland just because I'm at one of the few links style golf courses in North America. So and we're trying to be the best in the world is one of our goals. So to go and tour through some of the best that Scotland had to offer was kind of a little trip that we decided to take. I went there with Lee Strutt, and we toured around and talked to greenskeepers. Saw a lot of snow, but we saw some grass, and it was pretty cool.
Yeah. So do the surfaces? How far north did you go?
We went as far as Brora, which is north of Inverness, about an hour's drive, 100 kilometers. Yeah.
Was it covered in snow?
It had snowed that morning. We saw a little bit of grass walking through, but unfortunately not too much grass up there.
And does the species composition on those links courses, that on the ones where you did see quite a bit of grass, does the species composition look like anything that you've seen before in British Columbia, Washington, the prairies, or in at Cape Breton?
No, obviously most of these courses were, the ones where I could see grass. So courses like St. Andrews, obviously they're a little bit older than the course that I'm at now, which is just over a decade old. It was a much more of a hodgepodge of species, fescues, bents, Botopoa, but I would say from a playability standpoint, the conditions were amazing. So, if you're not super concerned about having a pure stand of a certain type of grass, which I don't think most people are, it's mostly about the characteristics of the surface and the amount of inputs that are required to produce that surface. So, just because you have a bit of POA doesn't mean that it's a high maintenance surface. So it was pretty good. I was very impressed with St. Andrews, especially with the amount of traffic that they get there. When I was there, they didn't have snow cover, but the ground was frozen, so the courses were closed. And it was kind of interesting because normally you would think that when a course closes, that gives it a rest. And like St. Andrews famously is closed on Sundays. But actually they get more traffic on those rest days because the entire town just comes out for picnics and they're walking around the course, walking their dogs, like the Right to Roam in the UK. So there is just people everywhere. So it was cool. We didn't have any golfers in our way. We didn't have to worry about getting hit by golf balls, but there was hundreds of people walking around the courses when they were closed. And I was impressed that there was any grass, to be honest, in a lot of these spots. So they were really, I was really impressed with the surfaces there.
Bjarni, did you ever work? Did you work at St. Andrews when you were going to school?
I lived in St. Andrews for 3 winters, and I worked the links for a couple of weeks, like the week leading up to and during the Dunhill Championship. Dunhill Championship is a pro-am tournament. Played on Carnoustie and Kingsbarns. I also did Kingsbarns as well. No, and as a resident of St. Andrews, we were able to purchase the what's called the links ticket. This is the sort of seasonal. We only paid back at the time. I'm assuming it's a bit higher now because it's 20 years ago. But we only paid £140, and we could play any of the 6 courses at the time. They didn't have the 7th at the time, but any of the 6 if you could get a tee time. So I've played the old course, I don't know, 20 times, 30 times. We would go there after what we call after dark hours, and where you can't finish 18 holes. You just show up, and if you have the tickets, you're able to do that. So I've played many times 16 holes. Try to drive in the dark on the 17th.
And walk in.
Not always finding the ball, I'll tell you. But it's true with the composition. I mean, if you walk on, for example, I think the first green at the old course is one of those greens that has a lot of other stuff. And what I did at the time, I don't know how, I haven't been to St. Andrews in a little while, but it had a lot of all sorts of species in there, even, play-in species and stuff like that. And play a bit, they didn't look great, that green in particular. Many did look great, but putting wise, I never had any problems. Sank some putts, got some birdies on the first. So honestly, I got birdied. Why are you so silent about that?
Well, I'm just thinking to hit over the creek and then the green's pretty firm. It's just it's impressive to hold the green and have a good birdie putt.
Yeah, the key is to go left, and you get a better angle on the green. Then you can put it into a wedge shot in there and just check it, slight fade. Happy days.
Jason,
it's great.
I wanted to know if you learned things from the greenkeepers that you talked with or the grass that you saw in Scotland. If you would pick one thing that you learned, what would that be?
That's a good question. Not to say it's learned. I was just impressed with how open everybody was, even at some very famous courses, and how hospitable they were. They all made a ton of time to just sit down and talk. And I learned that the challenges that I'm facing in Canada are very similar to the challenges that they're facing in Scotland. Labor, all of those things. And from a grass perspective, most of their challenges actually kind of are the naturalized or the native areas to the periphery, where the challenges are with growth that's too thick and lush, and then woody plant material like the gorse. There was every single place we went, gorse management was a huge topic of conversation, and it's a big issue for us here. We don't have gorse, but similar woody plants invading the naturalized areas. So nothing super groundbreaking by any means, but it was good to see that I'm not the only one that has these issues.
Cool. And Bjarni, you took a trip to the Caribbean, I think, and saw some tropical grasses.
Yes.
And that I saw you post some pictures of lawns and other things. Did you see any turf grass or pay attention enough to turf grass around the pool or along the beach to discuss or ID the species or anything like that?
No. To be absolutely fair, warm season is not my strongest field. I hope the drilling that's taking place isn't bleeding too hard into the mic right now.
Yeah.
So we were in the Dominican Republic. It was just me and the family. I didn't even take any golf clubs, or we didn't play anything. But as I do, There's a lot of noise here, isn't it? As I
It
do,
sounds like my recording studio sometimes.
we are installing a shower and bathroom here in our facility, so that's why the drilling is going on.
That's nice.
But no, yeah, but grass-wise, I'm always looking at grass, and my wife even starting to spot diseases in grasses. It's kind of sad, but obviously, but identifying them, I'm not the best at it. But obviously, seeing, I think I was seeing some Bermudas and zoysia grass somewhere there. But it's the funny thing is, though, for us is everyone there, the locals, were saying this is the cool season. And it was like
Yeah.
28, 29, 30 degrees every single day. So we Icelanders, we were just burning up on the beaches there. And it's like
Yeah, 'cause-
slapping on layer and layer of sunscreen. And we're just dying. And they're like, putting jeans on.
Yeah, it's different in a tropical place because the coolest that it might be is a high of something like that. So that's the cold time of year. You need sweaters.
And this is actually true. The nighttime temperature never went below the highest recorded daytime temperature in Reykjavik for the past 4 years. So yeah, that's how.
But
yeah.
Is that enjoyable for you and your family to experience those kind of temperatures, or is it traumatic?
No, I've obviously been to warmer places than that, but it's still, the kids sort of thought it was a little too warmish. I found out we Icelanders, we're really good at like building good warm houses and dress off the cold. And because I've realized that, for example, the locals there, you go to a supermarket and they, for some reason, refrigerate the entire building down to like 18 degrees or whatever. So when you go to the supermarket, we are freezing, the Icelanders. And I realized we as a species, Icelanders, we just love very narrow band of temperature, which is indoor temperature, 20 degrees. Anything above it or below it, we hate it for some reason. So I think we are the worst people for dealing with different temperatures. We struggle. Too much AC can't handle it. Too hot outside can't handle it. So, but no, it was a good time going there. We had an order to just relax. So otherwise, I would have been sort of touring the golf courses and then having more time looking at them.
Well, you helped me out with some audio for the Bill Kreuzer episode that I did.
Yes.
And you fixed that amazingly, where I had a unforced error on my part and just recorded my volume way too low and Bill's was normal. So to listen to it's something where you wanted to adjust the speaker, adjust the volume every time the speaker changed, and that's awful. So you fixed that. Thank you so much. And then you did some amazing work on that Australian Open video. So that was cool. Thanks for doing that while you were on your holiday. At least you could be in some cool temperatures then and get out of that baking sun.
It's because I'm a greenkeeper. We wake up pretty early, just naturally, I guess. And so I usually wake up like a couple of hours before the rest of the family goes up. So that's why I had time to do that and fix that. And then family hardly noticed. So good. That was good.
Well, we have a few comments here. I think we can circle back to the growth ratio topic, and we can discuss that for a while, respond to some of these comments and questions, and then we can maybe talk about BTME and some of that, and we'll just keep this cycle going until we decided that we've had enough. Randy, let's see if I think. How do I share these?
But there's one interesting point that is here from Eric Johnson. If it's okay if I jump in here.
Yeah, I was just I'm playing around with the studio and trying to bring up this to show it on the screen. There we go.
Okay.
So yeah.
So Eric Johnson says here, if the growth ratio is more usable or accurate during the growing season. So one thing that I have noticed in my part of the world, and I think this could be in other places, it just depends a little bit. And then that's why it's interesting to see more and more people using this. Like we struggle a little bit in the spring here in Iceland because growth ratio predicts such a super low, like for example, May for me, if I use the growth potential, it says it's going to give me something between 5 to 10, 15% growth potential. During a time I have about 7,000 people playing, on my golf course that month. And so usually my growth ratio would be somewhere about 500, 600, 700% in that time. So I usually find it hard to use it in that time frame. It's like once I hit later in the year, sort of in July, in August, September, then it sort of sinks in quite nicely, and I've been using it in that time. But I just know for a fact that I have to overshoot it quite aggressively in the beginning of the year for me. But mind you, we are in a unusual climate to most people. Long song hours and all that.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think Jason should have some comments on this because he used it in 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, 2022, a little bit north of, also in the Pacific Northwest. So Jason probably has some thoughts about what happens in the winter there.
I would say I was in the exact same climate as Eric. Really, nothing really that too different. And when the growth ratio the growth potential model, it's not great at low temperatures. It does have some issues. So when your average temperature is say 1 or 2 or 4 degrees Celsius for months at a time, it's not necessarily giving you the best data, but I've also kind of it's still been usable for me. I generally through the winter time, you get more growth than the model would suggest, and actually that's not a bad thing because in the wintertime I actually consider that if you have a winter, like a proper winter, but you're still open, such as the Pacific Northwest, they don't close, but the grass hardly grows through the winter. So if the growth ratio is showing that you're growing at actually quite fast, it's actually a good thing because I consider that recovery mode. Like all you're trying to do during the winter is limit the amount of loss. It's like your grass isn't being replenished. It's just slowly dying, and you're trying to have it die as slow as possible until it warms up in April. And so the growth ratio model typically will show a higher growth ratio through the winter. And I think actually that's what you want. So it's not necessarily, maybe not necessarily the most accurate, but it's still, I think, useful just to make sure that it continues to stay high.
I find it useful managing it into the winter months for me, especially going in September, October. I find really good correlation there, and it works pretty well. Well, correlation, okay, Micah, you're not going to like what I'm about to say.
Oh, man.
Because we modify.
That's fine.
I need to modify. Okay, I need to modify the growth potential formula. When
so
I
you said it
modified
for 18? You said it to 18?
I said it for 18, yeah.
Okay.
With 18 going into September, October, I actually lock in quite well, and the speedo works pretty well. And my speedo, I set it to 20 mil as well.
Okay.
So my speedo, so for example, my last mow of the year, I was sitting at about 80%.
Okay.
Which made sense to me at the time.
Yeah. So that for everybody in the UK, that's what you'd call the Mark Hunt growth potential, because Mark Hunt also adjusts it to 18, which it's just, that's okay to do, but just don't try to compare that to the regular growth potential, which has a optimum temperature set at 20, because if you do that, you're going to wonder why one of them is at 0.6 and one of them is at 0.83, and you're going to spend too much time trying to figure out if you've got an equation wrong in your spreadsheet. And that's, so I advise not to do it, but for advanced users like Bjarni or Mark Hunt, go for it. I just wanted to say, I think there's two things that I don't know the answer to about this. There's no doubt that when we look at the growth ratio in the springtime, it tends to be really high. And what that means in plain English is the grass is growing quite a bit more than the expected growth. And when I say expected growth, I mean the amount predicted by growth potential. So, and in the spring, you tend to have cooler temperatures. But there's two issues, and I don't know which one of these is the cause of this. Is it because the growth potential equation just completely is breaking down when the temperatures are that low? Okay, that's one option, and I don't know if that's the case. Or is it a grass effect as grass comes out of winter and out of a non-mowing period and moves into springtime and that flush of growth that you have? Is it like a spring flush, or is it a broken growth potential at low temperatures? I can't differentiate which one of those it is. I'm not sure, but I think everybody would agree that's used it. It seems to work pretty well mid-season, end of season. And for somebody like Chris Tridabaugh, his will work really well on bent grass in Minnesota after about 2 weeks. After the mower, like it gets normal after like 2 weeks into the season.
If I look at my clippings coming off the green, I'm not seeing a spring flush. I just go, gradually. Okay, I'm gonna get this right on the video. Gradually coming up, and then going down. If I have dips in my in the line here, that is usually related to some either irrigation problems, or I can account for that and understand why it is. But normally, in a normal year, for me, we go low. We go from around 5 milliliters, and then we just climb up gradually up to about 15 during the best days, 15, something like that, and then we just taper off. So it makes sense. It's completely normal. It's just that spring for us, when I mean spring, is May. It's usually colder than September, but we get similar numbers. Like what's coming off my greens is very similar. So maybe I should stop it.
It's not that loud, but
Okay,
yeah, I can hear a drill
in my ears. It's really just ringing. Anyway, so therefore I'm not seeing that spring flush. It's just that May is colder than September, but September, May gives me similar numbers.
I think it's really cool because we really haven't measured growth like this yet, or for very long, few years.
You mean we as an industry, Jason?
Yeah, like using the growth ratio. So I kind of found the more that I used it, the less I was getting those big spring growth surges with the ratio. But that might be because I was using the growth ratio into the fall, so I wasn't applying as much fertilizer maybe. So it's interesting here. First year at a new course, first year at a course with like an actual winter, we had massive growth once in like April and May actually, and it wasn't just massive to the growth ratio, it was massive throughout the whole year. Like our biggest clipping yields were coming from that time of the year. Now, I don't know. I mean, I kind of expect, or I have the records from last year or the year prior, the fertilizer records. But I wonder if that's just like a residual. There was a lot of like granular organics put down. If that was what I was seeing, or was it the model, or what? So we'll see. This fall, I went in using the growth ratio, and we put down quite a bit less into the fall, just because we had sufficient growth. So it'll be interesting to see next year if the growth ratio, as we come in, our spring is also May here, as the grass starts to wake up, if it's as big of a surge as we've had in the past, or what, I don't know. But it's at this point we're just kind of figuring that out. So I think there must be a plant response after coming out of like a survival instinct, right? You haven't been growing for the last 6 months. It kind of makes sense. It finally warms up. Let's just like let's shoot up as quick as we can to start getting that sunlight and everything else. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Yeah.
Since I start following, recording my clippings and looking at growth potential, it has changed how I approach spring management. And because in the past you would have gone, 20 years ago, I would have gone out with quite a bit of nitrogen granules form in the spring and trying to push growth and get it going, and it wouldn't kick in properly until the temperatures kicked in, and then we got a lot of growth. Nowadays, I don't do that. I keep it a little bit leaner because I'm looking at the numbers and I'm thinking, it's what I'm expecting. I'm expecting them to grow a bit slower due to temperature. Now, that has led to me having a more sort of smoother curve. So once the temperature kick up, I don't get this kick in growth that I used to have in the past. So I'm quicker to get good, speeds on the greens that, because usually when it starts kicking in like that, it will slow down the greens, get them bumpy. It will take a little, couple of weeks to sort of get the edge of that and try to get it up to better speeds. But nowadays, sort of managing them like this, getting smoother in, it's much better. But mind you, I'm higher on the nitrogen than I would have, again, growth potential would predict. But still, these are not high numbers by any means. We're applying through the month of May, maybe 12 kilograms of nitrogen or something per hectare, 1.2 grams-ish, which is very high for May and the temperature. But back in the day, it used to be in the 20s.
Yeah, that's not
24.
That's not much nitrogen. That's 2/10 of a pound of nitrogen for our American friends. We got all kinds of people who are joining in the chat. Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna say hi to Randy in Bulgaria, Eric Johnson in the Pacific Northwest. Randy said there's another person using growth ratio. He said that TJ from Olympic View in Victoria, British Columbia, he was over speaking at the Bulgarian Greenkeepers Conference, and apparently he's using growth ratio. So that's pretty cool. I forgot about that location that's using it. So now we have like at least 3 people that are using it, right? Let's see. Danny says good morning from Liverpool, England. Hello, Danny. Chris Tridabaugh had a user error on his alarm. Yeah, time zones can be tricky. And I know trying to coordinate this with me, and we're all 3 of us on this call are in different time zones, and I can imagine for us to coordinate and for everybody that wants to watch to coordinate, it could be a bit tricky. So no, Chris, we're trying to cycle through the growth ratio because we all realize we in fact, I talked about how you and I had that conversation in April. And we both thought that we totally understand it and talked through it and that you were going to use it that year. And then we realized mid-season, or you realized mid-season, that you weren't actually using the growth ratio in the way that we talked about in April. And that experience and all kinds of other experiences of me trying to explain it in seminars last year also, and just realizing like all of a sudden I've reached a wall that all of a sudden I can realize like people are not understanding what I'm talking about. And I thought, let's try to talk about growth ratio and just go through it again and again and again and keep trying to explain it, but maybe take some breaks and talk about Scotland or the Dominican Republic or BTME to take some break from growth ratio. And then we'll cycle back to talk about it again. So there's more growth ratio coming up. Let's see. Eric says, okay, yeah, so this is interesting. He's using models and Prism gauge to assist whether we mow or not. I think like Jason would say, just use your actual clipping volume to decide if you're going to mow or not, right? Like you wouldn't really rely on a model, would you?
I would agree with Eric, because the model might say you need to cut every 20 days, but there's too much variability in the weather over 20-day period. So you might have a couple of warm days in the middle And so to use like a predictive model to tell you when to cut, I think a stimp meter, if you're open, I used to go out and stimp the greens. And if they were slow, we would roll them. And if they were still slow, we'd mow them. And a Prism gauge, similar kind of thing. What's your height at? And you can see if the grass has grown, or your laser gauge.
Yeah.
Laser.
This thing is sweet. And look how small it is. See, it fits in the palm of your hand. And that's the case. I'm showing now this beautiful laser height of cut gauge invented by Alexander Grangs, the equipment manager at Shili Golf Club in South China. And it's got this line laser. So you put this right over it and it shines the laser through, and it's brilliant. So I'm sure a lot of people have bought this. It's wild what the price was. Like, I think less than $500.
Eric needs to buy one.
Yeah,
And
Eric.
Me too.
Eric says
To be
he
fair,
doesn't.
I would love that.
Yeah. So he said he does not have that gauge.
With the predicting, I usually tend to, like I said, because it sinks in quite well here. I can pretty well, sort of predict when we need to mow or not in the autumn. Because you get up to where you have to mow every once a week or something like that, every 7 days. And we've been able to predict it quite nicely. So to make sure that when we're going out and mow, we're getting at least more than 10, 15 in the buckets. Otherwise, it's sort of pointless. But I agree. Yeah, if you want to be sure, stimping is quite a quick way to go out there and just check it real quick, and to see if you need it or not. I'm a big fan of not mowing when I don't need to. I don't know about you.
Yeah, that was the original intent for me to measure clippings, was to limit the amount of time that I would go out and cut almost nothing, because it was just a waste. I had a staff of 3. It was like we went out and cut nothing. That's the goal. We could have done something else. And also just the stress of mowing. Mowing is very stressful, especially when the grass is barely growing. So
And spreads disease around, right?
Yeah, and that's why when I started reducing fungicide use, we really started to notice disease spread from mowing. So I would roll if I needed the speed, and then only mow. And I think there was years in the Pacific Northwest where I went like over 100 days without mowing, and I was able to keep the green speeds up through the winter. Now that was a low traffic.
I can sometimes go 200 days without mowing. Middle of the winter.
Same here.
Yeah, same thing going on.
I don't think I could get on the course with a snowmobile right now. So
no.
Yeah. But yeah, that's that was the original intent, and so I think like Eric uses a Prism gauge. That's measuring the actual thing that we want. That is the amount of growth that we've had, or how much longer is the grass versus how high we want it to be. So I think use a Prism. If you're managing ball roll, then use a stimp meter. And for growth, the growth ratio, it's not necessarily a playability thing. It's a fertilizer thing for me. It's a plant growth regulator thing. And then if you grow the grass at the right speed, it's easier to get those the performance of the greens. So it's whether it's traffic managed, like traffic tolerance, that's a performance thing in the summer when you have solid tee times, but it's also green speed. So at Cabot we have KPIs, and this year in the spring we hit our target green speed earlier than we've ever done, and that was, I was using the growth ratio, and we had this massive amount of growth, not just compared to the weather, but actually we were cutting a ton of grass, and I just didn't fertilize because we had enough growth, and the growth ratio slowly came down, and then when we got it to where we wanted it to, which is about 30% for fescue, we started supplementing with fertilizer to keep it where we wanted it to be at. And that just got us to where we wanted to be quicker. But the growth ratio didn't do it. We were also mowing and rolling and doing all of that stuff, adjusting heights of cut and everything else. But we weren't making our lives harder by growing the grass faster than we needed to.
Yeah, I think putting fertilizer on a schedule, or just like, I think like the way a lot of people fertilize is they've got a rate of fertilizer that they like to apply. And so it's sort of like they apply a tenth of a pound when they apply fertilizer, or they apply, 0.15 pounds or something, something like half a gram, or 5 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, that type of rate. And that's their standard rate, but they don't always apply it every 7 days. They don't apply it every 14 days. I think people tend to go fertilize when they think they need to fertilize. And then they're like, I'll just skip it this week. We'll get it next week because the grass already looks fine. So it's kind of like a bit of feel, and just keep reapplying that standard rate. But if you're just doing it based on feel, I think you can't do it as good as if you use the growth ratio, which is just looking exactly at how much it's growing and taking the way you feel about it out. You can still make the decision based on feel, but you've got that number to say, well, this is telling me that it's actually growing okay. I don't need to put that application.
It was really cool. So like this year, new golf course, 6,000 kilometers away from where I was before, different type of grass. So I'm growing fescue now, and they're, I would say 98% fescue, creeping red. They're still very, very pure, just because we're so new. And we had this massive growth coming into the spring, and so what I had to do is calibrate the growth ratio. So how I calibrated it was we were just watching that growth ratio drop. It was at like 500-600%, and slowly it's coming down as the season progresses. And we just, I mean, everyone's like, oh, these math models, it takes like the artistry out of it. No, like I had to go out there and look at the grass because I didn't know what the right growth ratio was for this climate, this type of grass, the size of the greens that I have. So we have about 2 hectares of putting green surface. So they're huge. So we might be able to get away with a lower growth ratio than someone that's growing fescue on 1 hectare of putting greens, right? Just, it kind of makes sense. You need, if you have less surface area, less traffic spreading, you have to grow faster. So anyways, growth ratio is coming down. And I'm lucky that it's an awesome thing about working at Cabot here is we have 2 golf courses. It's not just me. I have a bunch of other turf managers here who are world class. So our director of agronomy, Lee Strutt, and then the other superintendent, Jason Zeibel, it just makes it so easy to get it right because it's you have all this other experience. So using their experience as the growth ratio is coming down, they kind of help me say, this is like exactly what we want. This is what they should look like. And then at that point, it was at 30%. So I was like, okay, this is what we're at, 30%. And then I, of course, started playing around. But what happens if I get them down to 20%? Well, 20% was too slow. Started letting traffic issues, greens get a little bit bumpy. They don't look very good. So we bumped them back up to 30. So for my course, the growth ratio that we're looking for is 30. And if we need winter recovery, it might be 1. But that's kind of our standard rate. So that's kind of how I calibrated it here. And it was similar on POA. Just kind of watching the grass, observing the disease, observing the issues, and just trying to fine tune that number for your site. But I would say if you're going fescue, 30 is probably a good target. If you're going POA, 80 to 85 is a good target. If you're going bent grass, 40 to 60% is a good target.
And what we're talking again about this percent is it's your actual growth compared to your expected growth. So
yes.
Your expected growth always changes based on the weather. So the expected growth right now, so that's very site specific, your expected growth, and that's incorporating growth potential and a theoretical clipping volume to give you a expected growth of 0 when the temperatures are not suitable for growth, and it's giving you an expected growth of 20 liters per 1,000 square meters. Bjarni, is that right? Is that the right unit?
20
20 or
liters per thousand.
yeah, liters per 1,000.
Square meters,
Also
yeah.
20 milliliters per square meter.
Yeah.
So that it gives you that amount of clippings that's in the denominator. That's your expected growth if the temperatures are perfect. So this is terrific. I want to answer Danny's question. Danny from Liverpool is asking. He said he's found that the growth ratio has massively improved the green's health and performance. My question is, how do you figure out how much N you have removed from the clippings? Great question, Danny. You guess at it.
Well, I mean, so I have an opinion on this, and so the growth ratio is a tool. I used to try to figure out how much N I'm removing. There's math that Micah has on his site that can tell you how to estimate that closely based on the clipping volume. The growth ratio, I don't care how much N I'm removing, and I don't care what the model tells me how much N I should apply. All I care about is what my growth ratio is. So the growth rate's coming down. When it gets down to my target, I will hit it with a standard amount of fertilizer. For me, that's like 1 bag of urea. It's a 25 kilo bag of urea per hectare. So I have 2 hectares. I throw 2 bags in the tank, and then I watch the growth ratio kind of bump up. And then when it comes back down, I just hit it again. So I don't. It doesn't matter. What matters is I'm getting the right amount of growth. And I use the tools that I have to get that growth. Sorry, I think you should still, measure it, figure it out, do the math on how much N you are removing versus how much you're applying. But I just put the same amount of N every single time, and I time it based on the growth ratio. And I know I've read Chris does it differently. Micah, you helped him come up with a cool method. If you're stuck to a schedule, how to adjust that. Mm-hmm. But those things to me don't matter anymore. All I care about, and another reason why I don't care about them is because sometimes you're getting nitrogen from the soil. Mm-hmm. So you will have mineralization. And so the growth ratio takes that into account. So nothing else really, there's all these other models, theoretical models that do that. I don't care where the N is coming from. All I care about is, am I getting the right amount of growth? So if all of a sudden in the, what I used to get years ago was a big growth flush in August, well, the growth ratio would account for that because all of a sudden I'm getting the right amount of growth and I don't need to apply nitrogen to get that amount of growth. So I don't. So it makes it really easy. If your growth ratio is sufficient, don't apply any N. If it's low, apply N. So that's my opinion on that. But I'm open to. I still think it's really cool to measure it or to try to measure it.
I'll try to answer Danny's question, which is if somebody wants to estimate how much nitrogen you've removed from the clippings. Like, for example, one thing that you could do is try to estimate how much nitrogen you removed from the clippings. I wrote about that on Pace Turf today as one potential method. You can estimate how much you remove from the clippings, and then at the next fertilizer application, you take the cumulative amount that you think that you've removed, that you've calculated that you've removed since your most recent fertilizer application. You add in some kind of estimate of how much nitrogen you apply as fertilizer gets lost because you don't assume 100% uptake. So you add on a little bit more, and then you could reapply with that rate that's linked somehow to how much you think that you've harvested. That's one thing that you could do. I'm also recommending using the growth ratio method. I don't recommend doing this particular method, but it is interesting to estimate, especially like at the end of the year. You might want to know, I've applied 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, or 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. If that was the amount of nitrogen you applied, it's really interesting to know how much you harvested if you can get an estimate of that. And I jokingly said earlier that you guess at it, because unless you collect all your clippings and send all your clippings to a laboratory and measure how much nitrogen's in it, you are guessing at it. But what you do is you can figure that for any single clipping collection date, there's going to be a bit of variation. But on average, about the dry weight of the clippings is going to be about 6% of whatever the volume is. So if you have 1,000 milliliters of fresh clippings, if you have 1 liter of fresh clippings, we can assume that when dried will weigh about 60 grams. So that is our conversion factor. So we take our clippings and we convert it to an estimated dry weight, and then we just assume that we have however much nitrogen you want to assume that you have in your leaf tissue. You could check this sometimes and figure out how much you tend to be running with nitrogen concentration in your clippings. If you're really into this, it might be interesting to do a couple of times. Maybe you could check once in the spring, once in the summer, once in the autumn, or you could do this for 1 year and check once a month what your leaf tissue concentration is if you're really interested in this. But you don't need to do that, because you can assume for most cool season grass it's going to be about 4% in the clippings. Where it tends to be 5% or 6% is going to be where you're really aggressively fertilizing. But I think most people that are measuring clipping volume tend not to be really aggressively fertilizing, so they're probably going to be more in the 4% range. So now you've already converted from fresh weight to dry weight with that 6% conversion, and then you just multiply that times 4%. So you multiply that times 0.04, and that tells you your mass of nitrogen that was in the clippings, and then you divide it by the area that 1 liter of fresh clippings came from. And so the conversion factors that you use are 0.06 for 6% and 0.04. And that's how I solve that problem, and that's how I estimate how much I remove from the clippings. That's a very good question, Danny. And then you've got a follow-up question that is terrific, which is, how do you figure out the recommended nitrogen rate from your growth ratio? And I think, Jason, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Well, like I said, I just apply the same amount every time because I hate measuring, and the bags are already measured for me. So I just throw a bag in the tank, and when my growth ratio, I mean, seriously, the growth ratio dips, and okay, let's go out and hit the greens with a little bit of N, and let's bump that growth ratio back up. That's all I'm doing. Is I am pushing the grass to go faster. When I'm putting out N, that's what I'm doing. I want you to go faster. So than we currently are, and that's what the growth ratio does. It tells me I need to apply some N. So I just apply some N.
Okay,
like,
so
that was another thing. A problem is, like, when I apply N, how long does it last? Right? Like, you can have all of these models that try to guess how long a fertilizer lasts, but I don't really care. All I care is I'm getting the right amount of growth. So if I'm not getting the right amount of growth, I will push that growth with fertilizer.
It's like the way I sort of, I actually go a little bit lower than you are. If I'm in a growing season, I look at what's going to happen for the next, weather forecast wise, roughly what the temperature is going to be, and what the growth potential is going to be. So in a normal temperature range, I would usually go out with about 5K of nitrogen per hectare, which is similar to a bag of ammonium sulfide, 25K bag of ammonium sulfate is like 5 point whatever. So I would, I push it up there, and then I can sort of roughly estimate how long that's going to last, roughly based on the nitrogen, based on the growth, growth potential. And then what I do is just imagine what is the maximum nitrogen I would apply during a month, and that might be 20K, might be 30K, whatever. In your climate, we have to play around with this. So I'm not going to talk about exactly what I do, but I just assume that I'm doing this over, say 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, or 2 grams per square meter. Then you just multiply by the days you're looking ahead, like a week coming up. How much is that off the 30 days? So divided by 4-ish. And then what is the growth potential in that period, roughly? And then you multiply that. And then you see a number that is going to be, if I see that number being high, like 7-8 kilograms, I would increase my rate and put down 7-8 kilograms per hectare. Or if I'm coming into autumn and I know it's going to slow down quite a bit, I would drop that down to about 3 kilograms or ish, around about that time. But it's in a similar way that you do it. What I mean is, like, if I see I'm dropping growth-wise, I take the nitrogen out and I push it. And if I don't get the response that I need, I might go out again and kick it in. Because it's true, you can't exactly know what's going to happen nitrogen-wise, like very accurately, as accurate as you would like to when you're managing the green. So just looking at the growth, it's, and the growth ratio, if you start to drop below, just go out and hit it with a little bit of nitrogen. If you do that over and over and over again over a long period of time, you get a good feel for your greens, and you get, it becomes a bit of a, you can start doing this with a feel, if you like. But when I started, I really looked at the numbers like very closely. Now I'm sort of been able to say, like, okay, we're heading in there with about 3K, or looking at the forecast, it's about 5. It's 7 actually, so that's how I do it.
It's interesting. They're even though we're essentially using a model, like you said, there's a ton of feel, because we don't know what the weather's going to do in the next couple of weeks, and so it's kind of like there's a ton of feel, actually, because you're kind of like, is the model going to like plummet, or is it going to continue kind of stable? Like, what's going on? Do I use urea? Do I use ammonium sulfate? Do I use like a nitrate-based product?
By the way, I use urea. I just drop it down to 5K-ish range.
Yeah. It's easy for me to do a 5K app because I have 2 hectares of green, so 1 bag. And urea we kind of use that as a slow release fertilizer. It's a fantastic.
You guys in your bags,
season-long slow release
bags of product. You can do scales. You could put 13 kilograms. You can put.
I used to do that.
No, I need to measure it because my greens are like 1.6 hectares. So I don't. We measure it out. I know you like the bags because it just sits right in that range.
Just grab it. You throw it on the sprayer. Dump it. Good to go.
Yeah. But no, I will have to measure. But what I will say, though, about having these modules and how they help you out is that before I used the growth ratio, what I did, I used the growth potential and multiplied by a set number, like I told you before. Like, I had a set number for that month of May, maximum. If I had great weather, how much would I put in? How much nitrogen would I need? Imagining we had like 20 degrees every single day for the entire month. And we sort of, again, you play around and find that number a little bit with the experience. But then I broke that down to a single individual day, and then to multiply that with the growth ratio. And what I found is that sometimes I looked at the greens and I thought, they're actually kind of good. But my nitrogen is telling me I'm actually low. I'm going to trust my eyes a little too much. And then you come in next day and you're like, yeah, a little bit of nitrogen yesterday would have, you know what I mean? So when I start trusting these numbers a little bit better, it evened out my greens, because you sometimes dip a little bit. I'm not saying I crashed, by no means. I'm just saying you just knew you missed a spray, especially if that happened on a Friday and you had a weekend off and you come on a Sunday, you're like, oh my God, I should have trusted these numbers a little bit better. So with having the clip ball, actually knowing them and seeing them, that helps me even better. I think that's better than having just these calculations like I did before. But you need to learn your site, though. That's a key thing, because
I'm
these are
gonna
modules, and then you have to adjust them sometimes.
I'm gonna try to summarize in my own words, kind of the similar but slightly different ways that you guys approach this, and then mention the equation that Chris just showed, which is another way to deal with this. But Jason, I'll summarize yours first, and tell me if I understand correctly. You care how much the grass is growing, and that is the criterion that you're looking for. And if it's growing too fast, you're not going to put nitrogen. And if it's not growing fast enough, you make a nitrogen application at a standard rate. And that standard rate, tell me again the nitrogen rate that's your standard rate. Is it 50
Well, I mean,
kilograms?
it
Sorry, 5
depends on,
kilograms?
it depends on how much of a bump I want. But yes, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 10.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll put in 1 bag urea, 1 bag of ammonium sulfate. It's all based on how big a bag is, and not measuring.
Yep. Okay, so
But
you're
that's kind of
and then you're
I would
flipping.
say 5 to 10.
Okay, so we're talking about a tenth of a pound up to 2/10 of a pound of nitrogen per application. So you're basically just saying, here's my growth ratio, right? So you're not looking at the absolute clipping volume. You're looking at the growth ratio, and you're saying if the growth ratio is lower than you want, you put nitrogen, or if it's trending down and you see that it looks like it's going to dip below where you want it, you'll add some. And if it's above and you're fine, you skip nitrogen. Okay, that's simple. Did I explain it right?
Yeah.
Okay. Bjarni, I understand you to do something very similar. However, you adjust the rate not simply on how much the grass is growing today, but you look into the future, perhaps the next week of weather, perhaps the next 2 weeks of weather, and you consider what the nutrient demand may be in the upcoming time, and you then adjust the rate of the application based on that.
Yeah. But I always like to be on the low side because it's easier for me to, go out and apply more, and I can't turn back. If I apply too much, so that's why I tend to not go much above 5 degrees. It's 5 kilograms or 0.5 grams per application. But it's unless there is something coming up, like temperature is going up, then maybe I would hit the 7 kilograms. Going into tens means that I have an issue and I need to force growth.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I like to. I would rather go out and spray twice than overdoing it. But that is based also on, because I would not go, for example, in September. I'd rather just slow it down a little bit and go to the 3s, because I know that these are colder temperatures.
Mm-hmm.
So if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Okay, so
because I don't like spraying fixed days. I don't like going every other Monday or every Monday or whatever. I would rather do it according to what my grass is telling me, because like I said before, like if I drop below a certain level, then growth wise I know it takes me a little while getting everything back, and I don't like going there.
Yeah, that's very good advice. It's don't over fertilize. You can always go put some more out later.
Mm-hmm.
So we're almost. I mean, we've got all kinds of great questions. Unless we have a big crash, I think we're going to get to all of these. But I do want to explain another way that you can do it if you want to use an equation, and that takes into account the growth ratio that you want versus the growth ratio that you have. Okay, and that's the equation that Chris shows, which is specific to his units. So I think we're skipping ahead some questions, but we'll go back and get to those. So Chris shared a formula that is you you don't have to use the exact numbers here, but let me explain what it is. He said my formula, which Micah came up with, is 0.05. That's his nitrogen rate, times 0.3. That's his target growth ratio, divided by the trailing 14-day average growth ratio. That is the expected. I mean, that's the growth ratio that he's actually had at the site. Okay. And then he said there that 0.05 is his standard rate of N in pounds per 1,000 square feet, and 0.3 is the desired growth ratio. Let me try to generalize this and explain why this equation is going to give you a nitrogen rate that is adjusted from your standard rate, and it's going to be adjusted higher if your growth ratio is lower than you want, and it's going to drop your nitrogen rate lower if your growth ratio is higher than what you want. And so the equation is, it has three variables in it, or three inputs. You take the standard fertilizer rate that you like to apply at a single application. So we're talking here about spoon feeding, right? We're talking about you're applying just a little bit of nitrogen. So you take the rate that you would typically apply and you multiply that times the desired growth ratio divided by the actual growth ratio. Now let's just imagine. So that's the equation that Chris has shown. Let's imagine that your desired growth ratio is 0.5 or 50%, but you've actually had a growth ratio of 1. So it means the grass is growing a lot more than you want. So in that case, it's going to cut your nitrogen rate in half for that next application. And let's say that let's say you want a growth ratio of 0.6, but you actually had a growth ratio recently of 0.3. Now it's going to get doubled. So the way that it works is it's going to systematically adjust your standard nitrogen rate. So for people, I kind of think that like Jason's really on to something of like, what are we doing putting nitrogen when the grass is already growing faster? So should we just skip the application entirely, or should we just cut it in half? And that's where you're going to have to get a feel for how your grass responds. You're going to have to get a feel for how it works at your property. But the equation that's on the screen now, the equation that Chris showed, the equation that I've just explained, which is the rate of fertilizer that you typically apply in a single application multiplied by your desired growth ratio divided by the actual recent growth ratio, that is going to adjust your nitrogen in proportion to what the difference is. It's going to adjust it exactly in proportion to the ratio between your desired to actual growth ratio. So this is a turf math episode, and we have jumped way into it. So this is lovely.
So, I mean, Chris, so he says that the reason he does this is because he is also putting his schedule for fertilizer is based on his PGR schedule, which is tied to growing degree days. So he doesn't want to have to go out separately to apply all these different products. He puts them all in the same tank and sprays it all at once, which is just an efficiency thing. Mm-hmm. But I have a problem with growing degree day models, especially if they're used for PGRs. But I would like to preface this by saying that the work that like Kreuzer has done is it's amazing. It's so much better than what we were doing before. The problem I have with it is that it's a model used to apply products that manipulate growth rate, but it doesn't actually take the actual growth rate into account. So that's where the GDD model can get you close, But things like PGR stacking, where the cumulative effects of multiple applications can increase the level of suppression that you get from a PGR. If you aren't measuring the growth ratio, you could get over suppression. So Bill's done a lot of work on what happens when you stack PGRs and trying to get that model. But ultimately, we're using PGRs to manage growth. So you need to measure growth if you're using PGRs to manage that growth.
Well,
So
you don't need to, but you wonder why wouldn't you? It's really helpful, right? Because there's a lot of people using PGRs that don't measure clipping volume, but they should be.
I was applying PGRs, GDD, just like Chris, but then I found that the models, I mean, they're not perfect. They're just models. They're pretty close, but I was getting a stacking effect, and my growth ratio was dipping and dipping and dipping, but I was holding fast to that GDD model when I should have been actually like, hey, we're not getting enough growth. I'm applying N. I'm still not getting enough growth. Like, let's stretch this interval because I was getting that stacking effect. So the growth ratio can help you see if you are like getting too much suppression from a growth from a PGR. So I mean, there's another question on here, kind of asking about PGRs. Where was that?
Yeah, I'm gonna bring up Barry's. Yeah, Barry. Let's see, Barry asks.
And also the GDD isn't everywhere in the world the same. I'm always the one sticking out here because we have certain. I don't think it's been absolutely proven here yet, but there's very, very strong evidence that if you're in high light, long light, not high strong light, but like long day lengths, then the GDD actually drops and breaks down quicker. And so there's been sort of been talk about 150 being roughly more accurate than the 200 model. And then you can debate on that, as you were talking about. So therefore, I've never seen the stacking happening here.
Got it. I think it makes a lot of sense. And I've talked about this with Chris. I think about this about growth regulators. Sometimes I don't understand why people are applying so much nitrogen and so much plant growth regulator at the same time. And if you measure the clippings, you can figure out how much you can estimate how much nitrogen you're harvesting, which can help you to reduce your nitrogen rate back to something reasonable. I think a lot of the thatch, I mean, I'm changing the subject here, but I think a lot of the thatch problems in the industry come from people over fertilizing with nitrogen, and then they regulate the growth. And so the grass has a lot of photosynthesis and stores those carbohydrates into the soil, into below ground plant parts. And then I just think it doesn't make sense to put more nitrogen than the grass can use. So if you're not growing that much, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I really like the growth ratio as a way to fine tune or clipping volume, but the growth ratio is even better to fine tune your nitrogen and your plant growth regulator.
I got one thing on growth regulators. I can't prove this. This is a bit of anecdotal stuff, so excuse me there. But okay, I find that
this is the ADC channel, so we can speculate.
Yeah, we can speculate here a little bit. So on fescue greens with POA mixed into it, I find that the POA gets more regulated than the fescues, which is needed because the POAs actually grow quicker than the fescues. So if you use them on fescue greens, which is sort of counterintuitive because you're growing them slow anyway, it seems to give us a little bit sort of, I find we have a little bit more consistency in the growth rate of mixed species in this sense. But then again, there's a variation between species on how they pick up POA and how much they regulate it. For example, ryegrass, I remember we put it on once on a football pitch because we had a concert going on, so we had to regulate it while it was under the dark covers. And there we saw the huge difference between rye and Poa pratensis in regulation mode, because it was a massive difference how it came out of the regulation. But that's one reason why I find, Primo, for example, being fine on fescue greens when you have those Poas mixed in with them, because by the end of the day they get quite bumpy due to the Poa.
Thank you, Bjarni. So let's answer Barry Britton's question. He says, do you use growth regulation during the summer season? If so, why? And how does it relate to the growth ratio? Maybe, Bjarni, you could...
That was a little bit how I do it. It's because of that, and we will then expect to see some drop in the clip wall, but it's usually never much more than like 15-20%, something like that.
And Jason, do you use growth regulators these days?
I didn't this year. I was on my Poa Bank greens. I would use the GDD as a general timing. And I would use a GDD model. I've done a whole bunch of different playing around. I would use a GDD model and I would vary the rates. So if we got up to my reapplication interval and my growth was too low, I would lower the Primo rate and then still keep my standard N rate, just to bump the growth, reduce the suppression. And because generally the way I understand it from Bill's research is the rate determines the amount of suppression, not how long it lasts. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep, that's right.
So you can vary those rates, and then the weather determines generally how long it lasts. But I didn't use it this year. I might play around with it. I didn't really want to, try 100 different things on a new course and a new species at once. So
yeah, I think it tends to enhance turf quality. It enables you to have better performance in shade. It enables you to have a lower effective cutting height, basically. So whether you can cut the grass shorter, more safely, or whether, somehow you can have a lower effective cutting height. So it offers some advantages, but I look at it as something that wouldn't be like the foundation of my program. I feel sometimes some people that have used it their whole life, it's just like, oh, it's Thursday, we need to get our second PGR app of the week down before the weekend. And I know people that manage like that, multiple time a week PGR apps, where it seems like that's kind of the foundation of the program. And to me, it's something I would add on. So I'm going to first manage the grass with 100% grass cover. Make sure I've got my irrigation under control. Make sure my mowers are set up as good as they could be to have really good cutting units and cutting the grass at the appropriate height with sharp mowers, and then get the nitrogen rate right. And look at how much the grass is growing, all of that stuff. And then if I realize I could make it even better by adding a growth regulator, that's at the point where I would add on the growth regulator. But I find sometimes I talk to people that don't seem to be managing that way, and they're trying to do everything at once and putting so much growth regulator. And then they ask me to evaluate their fertilizer. And I'm like, I have no idea. If you don't know how much the grass is growing and like definitely you've got stacking with those kind of Primo rates, so who knows what's going on. And I'm like I would apply nothing until I could figure out what was going on. But anyway, yeah, I think, Barry, the standard way is yes, continue using growth regulator, and you can see how it works with the growth ratio. And Chris Trittabaugh did that last summer. He's used growth regulators for a few summers now with clipping volume, and yeah, he gets the type of clipping volume he wants with growth regulator, which leads to another good question here from Chris Elric, who's asking about, he says, can you guys touch on your clip vault targets? Would you say that 15 milliliters is standard, 20 to 25 for recovery, maybe below 15 for competitions? And so this is talking about absolute clipping volume, and this is the exact question. This is so good, Chris. Thank you. This is the exact question that led to our excitement about talking about the growth ratio. And who wants to take this one?
I would say that it depends on the weather. What your target clip fall should be. I mean, generally we want a lower amount, but it depends like what is low. Low in August is different than low in May or low in February. So depending on your location. Yeah, my standard amount is 20, and then I multiply that by the growth potential, and then I grow at 30% of that speed. But I mean, if you don't want to use the growth ratio, then 10. Say 10. Don't go below 10. Go below 10 for short periods of a week, but no more. And yeah, I don't know.
I've now managed a number of courses with different sort of grass species, and I find like if you're running them on pure POA greens, I always needed to keep them a bit higher for them to perform the way we wanted. So our ideal growth rate was in the 30s for that POA to function in our climate. Then I've had fascues and relatively pure fascues, and they do really, really well in the sort of 10 to 15. So it's going to depend on climate you're in, what you're growing, to find that absolute number. You can run the growth ratio a little bit. I know you, Jason, you're running it, but with the fixed number of 20 milliliters as an ideal. And then if you're trying to grow it slower than that, you go for the percentage, 0.3 in your case where you're at the moment.
Yeah.
You can, of course, if you like to dial your percentage into 100%, and then you change the 20 to the desired volume that you for your site. So you can run it that way. I actually run it that way because I like to keep, tell them I want to be at the 100% mark. But you need to, it's kind of hard to say exactly what it is because I've had fascue greens, for example, Kalir fascue greens, I had to run in the 15, 16s. That would be great. These fascue greens I have here are lower than that, and they're fine. So it's a difference, even though I'm growing in the same climate, growing the same grass, you still find a slight difference in what's the sweet spot. Maybe it's because these greens are very, very big. They're 1.6 hectares, the other one's at 1 hectare for 18. And similar traffic numbers. So it's kind of, but I think a good start is saying 20 milliliters during ideal conditions and then using growth potential to figure out if it's normal for you to be in the 5s or 10s for the day. Does that make sense?
You're such a turf grass math rebel.
You always preface it by like, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Micah might not like this.
I tend to approach things differently sometimes, I do admit.
Yeah, I would answer that, Chris, by saying it sort of depends on the site and the grass, and like with ultra dwarf Bermuda grass, a lot of people grow it so slow that they get numbers like 3 milliliters, 4. And that's kind of standard for them. It's
the entire point of having the growth ratio. That's what the growth ratio answers is this question. What is it?
Yeah, and that's what the growth range answers, because I would expect when Bjarni was in the Dominican Republic and their high temperatures were less than 30 degrees Celsius, the golf course superintendents there who are growing warm season grass would probably feel that the greens are barely growing compared with the summer conditions when the high temperature might be 35 degrees, the low temperature might be 24 degrees, and the grass might grow twice as much. And so the question is, what is your target? Well, it's just kind of normal to adjust it. And I mean, you look at the growth ratio, and that automatically adjusts your expectation through the year as the temperature changes. So thanks for bringing that up. Let's see. Randy's got a question that I thought about once. He said, is it possible to link prism gauge measurement? So you're measuring how tall the leaf is above the mowing height, for example. Is it possible to link prism gauge measurement to clip vol somehow? Let's say we have 1 millimeter of growth. Is it possible to predict or calculate how many clippings we will get and then have a virtual growth ratio? Randy, that's a really good question. I had like a vision one time when I was in a van down to Malaysia on a visa run. And then I stayed in this hotel in Penang, Malaysia, and I made a bunch of notes in one of my notebooks about this, and then I realized I couldn't come up with an answer. And I remember sending an email to Bjarni, and this was about 5 years ago, Bjarni. I think probably August 2019. And I sent an email saying, you're really good at math. Can you like visualize this? Because I was like, I'm trying to convert between 3 dimensions of like how I'm like the grass, if it grows up this much, how much volume is that going to be? And we should be able to predict clipping volume from that. And we did have this conversation. You told me we're missing a couple things that we would need to measure. And you need to know the density of the leaves in terms of spatially how many leaves. You can't just look at how far up it grows. You need to know also how many leaves there are per square centimeter or per square meter. And you don't really have that looking with the Prism gauge. So I have a notebook somewhere where I have all kinds of mad notes about it because it's a long van ride down to Penang.
I remember it now, but I totally forgot about this conversation. But
So good question.
Yeah.
I thought we could do it, and I've kind of despaired of being able to do it now.
Yeah, I also find that with Prism gauge, it's hard to be. Well, I haven't tried your laser one, to be fair, but it's hard to sometimes. It's like, how far off can you be, if you know what I mean? It's like if you're measuring 1 millimeter and trying to measure it with your eye of increased growth, and you know how the grass is not perfectly, it's not going to be perfect on the Prism, then you could very easily be 20-30% off, which then is quite a bit off.
Well, that's why I'm so excited about this laser one, because I've recognized that the effective cutting height is quite important, especially for green speed. However, I've never trusted my own eyes with a conventional Prism gauge because the way that you change the angle that you look at it, you can change the height by 20, 30, 40, 200%. And this laser one, it's very satisfying to move that laser along the scale, and then you see that plane of light either being completely in the canopy or just at the tip of the leaves or all the way completely above the leaves. It's been very satisfying for me, and just to realize that the angle at which I'm looking at it has no bearing now because it's completely squared up. So it's pretty cool.
I mean, I can rain on your guys' parade here.
You solved this. You solved this a long time ago.
Well, so I don't use a Prism gauge. My mechanic uses a Prism gauge. We use Prism gauges to assess quality of cut. But for me, I'm managing greens for ball roll, so I use a stimp meter. And I've noticed that at different times of the year, so we go up to in wintertime on POA, we were I'm sorry, I'm not metricified on heights of cut. We'd go up to like 180 thousandths of an inch. That was our high height, and we would have green speeds 11 plus. In the summer, we'd be down to 110, and we would struggle to get 11 because the growth rates were a lot higher. I think a lot of green speed isn't necessarily ultimately height of cut. It's like there's the rigidity of the plant, right? In the wintertime, it's not growing. It's kind of soft and limp. In the summer, it's growing. It's very rigid and upright, and it was harder to get those speeds. So I am not using a Prism to dictate how I mow or manage my greens, other than is the mower getting all the grass when we cut it, or is it leaving stragglers? Because you want your mower to go out. When it goes out, you want it to be working the way it's supposed to be. So that's just my Debbie Downer opinion on Prism gauges.
Well,
Actually,
when it relates to growth and managing putting greens. Yeah.
Yeah, because we have the Scanturf research plots that we have here, and we're supposed to measure growth with the Prism, and I find it so inaccurate. When you're trying to say how much it grew, like I said, it's so easy to go 20, 30% off.
well,
And I think
I've owned 0 Prism gauges in my life until this one. This is the first one that I thought is like, this is something I could actually use, because the other ones, like Jason says, it's just something that he uses to check the quality of cut, maybe. But
which is fine for that.
I mean, I would, I hate to be the curmudgeon here, but I would be surprised if you find something more useful even with the laser one. It's cool. You can get the actual height. So you can, so for measuring bench height versus the height in the field, awesome. That's a really good tool. But I honestly, I don't really even care what the height is. I just care, am I getting the speeds? And do I need to lower the height or raise the height? Ultimately, it doesn't really matter.
I agree with you. I agree with you. It doesn't really matter. But I'm a scientist, and it's interesting sometimes when I document what the green conditions are. I've never been documenting the cutting height. And then people often ask, like, well, did you check the effective cutting height? I'm like, no, you can't measure with one of those. So I don't want to record useless information. And suddenly I feel with this that, like, here's a tool that maybe I can use for research. I'm not saying I'm going to use it for everyday maintenance, but for me as a researcher, I think it's pretty cool.
Definitely a good update.
I agree 100% with that. But as a practitioner, somebody who my job is to have conditions, I think it's next to useless. Other than, are my greens slow because the mower is only cutting half the grass? But or is it tearing the leaf blade, and is that why we have disease and crappy turf conditions? But for growth and green speed, I don't see a correlation at all. But sorry.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing so openly. And David down in Australia, I don't know if he's still awake down there, but David, we're getting to your comment here that's very good, which you're still awaiting. He says he's still awaiting the mower manufacturers to give a yield or clipping rate. And it does seem that should be possible someday, but it hasn't come yet. I know when I first started advocating measurement of clipping volume, that was something that I started suggesting in 2013, 2014. And I remember talking with a lot of people. All right, David. So
jealous.
He's still awake. So the response that people would say is, why should I dump it in a bucket? I'm waiting for them to put a laser beam that counts the number of clippings that go through, or how many leaf blades broke through that laser beam, or they're waiting for somebody to have a scale, or they're waiting just for the simple innovation of putting a graduated scale on the mower bucket. So instead of on the basket, so you could just like turn it sideways and it tells you how many liters there are. I haven't seen any of those innovations happen yet, but some people say that that's what they're waiting for. So, I don't know. I guess it will come someday. Have you guys heard anything? You guys went to BTME. I guess with the with those little electric mowers, they can sense how thick the grass is that they're cutting or how much resistance there is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't think they can count.
No, they're not
It might
expressing
be
it as
harder.
clipping volume.
But they sense the resistance. I don't know how much or accurate the correlation will be. But then again, never say never. There might be a solution. Saying that, I mean, I think greens mowers will always be reels mowers because of cutting height issues. But do we need them?
Unless we start using lasers to burn the grass off.
Well, yeah, or that.
So yeah, Chris
Sound like Austin Powers there.
Chris Trittabaugh said that going back to the nitrogen rate, he found a good place, and I think by that he means that the grass quality is pretty good and the growth rate is pretty good when the nitrogen that he applies is similar to the amount that he calculates that he harvested in clippings. So he definitely is doing that conversion of 6% to get to the dry weight, and then assuming 4% in the clippings, and he gets it pretty close. So that's something that he's comfortable with, and I think it is useful for people to check that out.
I think it's interesting. I've done it at all 3 courses. At Pender Harbor, I was always getting about an 80% return on the nitrogen that I applied from the clippings. And then after a few years after I left, Alan, who took over from me, he was getting over 100%. So he was getting more than he applied. So that was interesting. At Sunshine Coast, I struggled to get 60% return. And maybe that's inefficient nitrogen apps. Maybe my higher but more spaced out dose is less efficient, probably. Less efficient nitrogen wise, but cost wise, the nitrogen doesn't cost anything. It's basically free. It's my time, which costs more. And the diesel in the sprayer costs more than the nitrogen I'm applying by like a big margin. So we weren't very efficient there. And then same thing this last year, not super efficient as far as what we were harvesting versus what we were applying. And I think
are these younger greens or
yeah, exactly.
less organic
and so
breakdown?
Yeah, so I mean, right now where I'm at is we have very low organic matter levels in our greens. We are just over 10 years old. At Pender Harbor at the time, we were 30 years old. And then at Sunshine Coast, the greens were about 15 years old.
Yeah, so you're putting carbon into the soil. And there's some nitrogen that goes with it. So I suppose that age of the green, like Bjarni mentioned, is very has quite a big impact there.
As we're coming up on 2 hours, which I will probably have to leave around. I'm looking at these 2 questions here from Barry and then Eric's recent observation, and I have thoughts on both of those. I think they're super interesting.
Is it Barry's about do you go beyond greens and apply growth ratio to fairways and tee surfaces?
Yes.
Okay. So let's discuss that first.
So on my greens, I generally don't manage different parts of a green different, but on tees, I manage my tees completely different. So I put out a monthly slow release urea app to all the tees, usually with a wetting agent, which I'm probably going to have to reevaluate now that Bill has his GDD model for wetting agents now. But anyways, I put that out. I'm super excited. So I go out and I put that general rate, but I have tee boxes, and we do 40,000 rounds a year. I have tee boxes that get 50 rounds. do you not need as much fertilizer as the rounds that get 25,000 rounds. And all my tees are different sizes. I mean, every turf manager could probably relate, but your par 3 tees are always the smallest. And it's like, golf architects, please work with us here. and then our par 5 tees are like, 3,000 square foot tee with, that has 4 divots on it a month. And so anyways, I don't manage the tees the same way. I put out a general just maintenance app, and then I go out and I hammer the tees with traffic. And I use my eyes. It's like more fertilizer on for us, the silvers and the greens. And then I go out a week or two later. Are they recovering or not? More? But then I have other tees that are just like soft and spongy. They don't get any traffic, and we don't even fertilize them. It's just like don't grow them any faster than they are, because they don't need any traffic tolerance. So that's how I do that. Similar on fairways.
Yeah, we don't, because we're not boxing off tees. We would have to box them to get these numbers. But to be fair, because our tees are usually, there's more variation in tees than there are in greens. There's actually an argument to measure them. So you do exactly what you're talking about, to dial them in a little bit more accurately.
Yeah, I'm not trying to grow them slow. I'm just trying to keep grass.
Yeah,
exactly. Organic matter it's not a concern. Organic matter buildup is not a concern. We have tons of divot mix on these tees. So, like, if anything, they don't have enough organic matter, because they're getting this much top dressing every year. So that's tees for me.
Yeah,
I mean,
if you want to dial in the consistency, tee to tee to tee, then sure, yeah, it's a good. I would think it would be a good way to do it. And if you are boxing off already, you might as well just check it if you like to.
Yeah, you need what David suggested, when the manufacturers are gonna do it automatically. But yeah, it doesn't seem feasible right now.
I don't see the utility in it.
Not at all.
It's not going to make my life easier.
No. I mean, yeah, but if you're in an area where you're hand cutting, if you've got already high-end facilities and you're trying to even everything out, and you're hand cutting the tees anyways, you're boxing them off anyways, sure. But sometimes, yeah, because we're not boxing off, then it's gonna, no struggle.
And then so that's, and then for fairways, I do a maintenance rate, and then I just drive around with the sprayer and I paint high traffic areas with more fertilizer. I'm just like driving around. This grass doesn't look very good. Hit it up. So it's variable rate essentially. Giving it where it needs it, and then wherever, because we have 18 hectares of fairways here, so they're big, and if we grew them as fast as we required for the weakest spots, we couldn't keep up with the mowing. So.
Yeah, the problem with managing clippings of fairways, because it's such a big variation usually in golf courses in how they grow, then mowing that entire fairway might, you might be on average okay, but actually you're too low, you're growing too slow in areas, and it's too hard to manage it that way. So I think that will be
it's super easy, though. It's super easy to go with the sprayer with a good dose of fertilizer and just drive around the course, and just because you're not spraying all the fairways, you're just spraying the high traffic spots or the spots where the turf needs more growth. It's very time efficient and massively cost efficient, because you're not growing the grass too excessively fast everywhere. You're only pushing the growth where it needs it.
This is where the space lasers that David was talking about, there's going to be measuring. He taught space lasers, right? If we could actually measure, like, instantaneously what was going on, then that would be great. And then input that into a GPS player and then deal with it. But from a bucket, it's kind of hard from a bucket on a fairway. Tee, sure, but
We've got another interesting comment that Jason mentioned. This is from Eric Johnson in the Pacific Northwest. He says, in my opinion, the growth ratio gets a little bit tricky with Poa annua, creeping bentgrass mixed stand, especially with their different response to inputs during the growing season. Jason's had some experience with this.
Yeah, so actually both of my previous courses, Pen Harbor and Sunshine Coast, started with dominated POA and then was transitioning to bentgrass. Pender Harbor now is I would say at bentgrass greens. I mean, I haven't been there in a year or two, but it is bentgrass dominated greens. Sunshine Coast is getting there. And I noticed that with the growth ratio, there's a different speed that you need to grow the grass depending on the species. Now, POA needs the most growth in cool season from what I've seen. Now, science might prove me wrong one day, but first, scientists need to figure out the growth ratio. But I think you can use the growth ratio as a tool to say promote bentgrass over POA. So set that growth ratio below 85%, and now you're not really growing the POA fast enough. You're growing the bentgrass just fine, keeping the bentgrass competitive to fill in those spots. So as a transition tool, if you don't have the chemicals, which we don't or didn't in Canada, I think that's something you can do. So.
What number would you guess that if you wanted to keep them static? So let's say you had 50% POA, 50% bent in your stand. What type of growth ratio would you recommend?
I would say grow the POA 80, like grow on the low end of POA. So don't grow it over 1. Growth ratio, keep it at around 80%, 80 to 85. That's what I would recommend, because you have to keep the POA happy. And if you start growing it too slow, the POA, it's anthracnose just will have a field day. So if you have a lot of POA, don't grow it too slow. Keep it on the low end, but not too slow. If you have a little bit of POA, then bring on the heat, but bring on the pain. Grow it slow. And this year, I mean, we were actively encouraging anthracnose on our POA.
Yeah, you Grant Saunders at Hamilton Golf Club in New Zealand has a stunning time sequence of photos and a nice story that I would like to talk with him about sometime, of inheriting greens that were mostly POA, and you go there now and it's all colonial bentgrass, and that's happened by growing the grass slow enough that the POA disappears eventually. But it's not pretty doing that transition. But boy, it sure is pretty going on those greens now and seeing pure colonial bentgrass, and you can't find a POA plant. And so I think this can be used for transition, and it can also be used to make sure you're not regulating it too much or not growing it too slow, that you're putting or you're not starving the POA so much that you're in it. If you want to keep POA, you can use the growth ratio to make sure you're growing it enough to make it a viable competitor against creeping bentgrass. And yeah, I guess the other thing is, this is really new. So now we've figured out, we've got Danny in Liverpool says he's using the growth ratio. TJ Kramer at Olympic View in Victoria is using it. Bjarni plays around with it a little bit. Chris Trinaball is doing it. Jason's doing it. So we got and I guess Eric's pretty familiar with it. So maybe we got 5 to 10 people around the world that are actually intensively doing this, right?
When I was at BTME, I had, I would say, half dozen people stop me on the street. So this is just, I'm walking through town, and they would run across the street. Are you Jason Haines? I'm like, yeah. I've used the growth ratio. I think it's a great tool. So I think it's a little bit more common than, say, 6 people. It might be 20 or 30. But also there was a turf grass amenity company that they actually have a spreadsheet that they give to their customers to help them with all the weather models and everything else, and they're using it now. So I was surprised to see the growth ratio being used by fertilizer companies now, or turf grass consulting companies. So that is also starting to happen, which is kind of cool.
Well, good. So awesome. So we are talking about something that I think we all agree we would not spend 2 hours of our time talking about this if we didn't think that it was something that had all kinds of value. And I think that eventually a lot more people will do this because it turns out to be a really useful tool. And I know Chris had to leave. He said thanks, and but he had to leave the call. But I know his nitrogen rates have gone down and down and down. And he put less than a pound of nitrogen last year, which I would have thought is 30% of what I would have thought you'd need for bentgrass in Minneapolis. Now, I don't know how much he'll put this year, but I know that the conditions last year were superb, and using a fraction of the nitrogen that he used before. The reason why people can do this is because they're measuring the clipping volume and finding the grass is still growing enough. I don't need to put so much fertilizer. And the implications, of course, are if the grass doesn't grow so much and you don't put so much nitrogen, you don't create the thatch, you don't need to do the disruption, so you have better playing surfaces for more days in the year. So it's really exciting. We're excited about it, and if you're watching or listening to this, you probably are too. So yeah, we're a small happy group of
especially on hour number 2, then you must be quite dedicated.
Yes, definitely. Good. Yeah.
Cool.
So Eric says that at the GCSA show there seemed to be more interest in clipfall. Yeah, I don't know how there can't be, because it's just such a useful kind of tool, isn't it?
Danny Patton says he'd like to have more input. I would suggest joining the Discord server, that the Asian Turfgrass Discord server, where there's lots of discussion going on. And I tend to check on it every week or so. And I mean, the more people that chime in, the better, I think. And that's a really good spot for that, I think.
All right. Well, we've answered. We got through. This is perfect timing because we talked about basically all the things that I wanted us to talk about on this call. We've answered all the questions so far, and we also hit about the 2-hour mark, which is kind of what I was thinking was about how long we would discuss today. If there's any more questions from people, I'll stick around for a little while longer. But otherwise, we'll get ready to say goodbye. And yeah, Danny, please join the Discord. You can find that the link to that at asianturfgrass.com. And anything else from you, Bjarni? You did want to argue that one unit, the 1,000. Let's talk about clipping volume units. I started off by accident doing liters per 100 square meter.
Yeah.
And then I realized I don't like 100 square meter. What kind of silly unit is 100 square meters in the denominator? And so,
my unit now is liter per 1,000.
yeah. So which is the same number that you'll get from milliliters per square meter.
Yeah.
And I
It's the very
realized
same number.
I realized that Bjarni seems to like the kind of units, I think, where he can really visualize the numerator. And I tend to like the units where I can see or visualize the denominator. Because and I think that's kind of why we often have a different preference in units. Because I'm like gram per I like a square meter as a denominator. But you prefer a hectare usually. But I notice you often want a liter.
I like units where you can actually. So, for example, if I give you 1 gram of nitrogen, or if I give you 2 grams of nitrogen and put it in your hand, there's no way you're going to know the difference. If I give you 10 kilograms of something and then 20 kilograms of something, everyone feels the difference. So, for like especially talking to my staff, and why I like the liter things instead of milliliters is we're measuring in liters, and it goes into the buckets. So if you go liter per thousand, that number is going to be close, like in liters, it's going to be close to what they're actually getting into the buckets. So, for example, if you measure just one bucket on a triplex mower, and let's say your green is about 400 square meters, you know, then the number liters per thousand is going to come out very similar to the amount of liters in a single bucket.
If you're
of
measuring a
triplex
single
mower.
bucket and
If you measure
multiplying
single
by
bucket
3.
from a triplex, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you get your similar number. It's not going to be the same, but it's going to be a similar-ish number. So the feel for it, and when you say milliliters to the staff, for example, they just like milliliters. Sounds a very tiny fraction. But if you just say liters per thousand, it seems to be the same. Oh yeah, sure. It's 1 point something we got in the bucket, or 2 liters we got in. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of like that one. So maybe
and
that
it
one
brings
has some
together
potential.
the imperial, because they like pounds per thousand. We need to have per thousand in the metric. So liters per thousand, we can say that now. But it's just same thing for my fertilizer. If I'm in kilograms per hectare, it's very similar to what I'm putting into the tank anyway. So kilograms per hectare. Yeah. Instead of saying grams per square meter, because gram is such a tiny unit. And that's why I'm not a big fan of it. Saying that, I do like it in the scientific literature that they stick to that grams per square meter, because sometimes you're reading something from some other field, not necessarily turf. And I don't like it when they have their specific units that they like to use. Prefer it being just grams, and then you just can move away from that. So that's where, in scientific literature, I agree, stick to that. But for practitioners, it's quite handy to have these liters, kilograms, because you're dealing with liters and kilograms.
Yeah, we should write something sometime about units and just kind of make some suggestions. Maybe we can do that sometime, because you often have good insight. I'm going to answer Nolan's question. Nolan asks, when you talk about applying parts per million of phosphorus in relation to MLSN, is this in elemental phosphorus or P2O5?
Yeah, the oxide.
And the answer is, when I say P or phosphorus, and if I'm talking about quantities, you can expect that I'm always going to be referring to elemental unless I explicitly state otherwise. Now that's how Micah does it. With everybody else, you have to check, and that's a very good question, Nolan. But with me, I'm always talking about elemental. But sometimes for fertilizer rates, I'll adjust it, but then I'll state how much P2O5 one would need to apply.
Can I give the lazy answer?
I don't apply I don't apply phosphorus.
Yes, but when I do, I'm just using the trend. So if I'm happy where it is and it's going down, I apply more than I did last year. And if it's going up, I apply less. Like the actual individual numbers are less important to me than the trend. The individual numbers are nice to know. If don't go too low, or if you're too high, you could probably just forget about phosphorus for a few years. But it's just the trend lines. So I mean, you can do all this crazy math to determine it at all. But I think the most important thing is just trend data, and then just know what you put down last year, and then adjust. Do I need to put more or less? So there's no math. Sorry.
In an episode of maths, there's no maths.
Well, I mean, honestly, like if you can reduce the amount of math and the amount of data that you need, it's totally the best.
I agree. Try to simplify things.
I've done that whole thing, but I find as a practitioner, not again, the difference between scientist and practitioner is I'm mostly concerned with the trend data. And it wasn't until I had trend data from Micah that all of a sudden managing soils was just like all of a sudden it just became easy. It's just like, oh, it went down. Let's do more than we did last year, or we still got a ways to go. Let's see if we can kill some POA here.
But I think that goes to show how good measuring a clip ball and this growth ratio thing is that from a person who doesn't like measuring stuff, doesn't like, like you say, keep it simple, you see how valuable that is, so that's a day that people should be doing, definitely. Would you agree with that? I think that's the,
Yeah. I think
measuring
people have
clip
this
ball.
false sense of who I am. Like, I use data a lot in my decision making, but like I'm not recording like Prism readings. I'm not recording. I'm writing down how much nutrient I apply. I'm recording clipping volume, and I'm collecting stim meter. Like, it's not a ton of data, and then obviously weather observations to get the so average temperature and then precipitation and ET and all that. But whatever, it's not it's not like I'm out there just like in data hell. It's very pretty minimal, almost no work on my end, and just helps me get it right.
I guess we all try to do this stuff to make it easier, right? If you think about it, and then if it does make it easier, we keep doing it, and if it doesn't make it easier, we kind of throw it away or stop doing it. So, well, Jason, that's cool. That must have been a nice feeling to walk down the street in Harrogate and have people asking if you were Jason Haines.
It was a little bit.
That doesn't really happen to me very often.
Yeah, I'm a
down in
little bit grass famous. But it was pretty cool. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, nice. Well, I think this has been long enough for this episode. We certainly talked through that subject, and thank you guys so much for sharing your expertise and time with us. And thanks everybody who caught this live. And I know a lot of people will be listening or watching this later. So thanks everyone for your interest in these kind of esoteric turfgrass topics, but something that we think is worth our time and obviously your time. So we'll change the world with all of this awesome work.
No pressure.
Well, yeah, it's a big impact when you have better playing conditions, less sand, less nitrogen. It's transformative in the way one manages. So,
yeah, definitely.
Good. All right, guys. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. I'll go ahead and end this stream now. So I'll sign off for ATC from Trong, Thailand. I'm Michael Woods. Bye-bye.